The mahogany conference table stretched endlessly before me as I sat in the corner chair, watching 23 years of my life being casually dismissed by a man who had never worked a single honest day in his privileged existence. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus Wellington III, with his perfectly pressed Armani suit and gold Rolex that cost more than most people's annual salaries, was telling me that my services were no longer required at Wellington Financial Group, the company where I had started as a junior analyst fresh out of college and built into the most respected wealth management firm on the West Coast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Seattle. I had arrived at 6:30, as I had every morning for the past 19 years, reviewing overnight market reports from Asia and preparing briefings for my clients, who controlled a combined portfolio worth over $1.2 billion. The view from my window overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries moved like toys across the dark water, carrying commuters who probably earned in a year what some of my clients spent on a single vacation. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until this morning I was the Senior Vice President of Client Relations at Wellington Financial Group, responsible for managing the investment portfolios of 47 ultra-high net worth individuals who had specifically requested to work with me rather than any of the firm's other advisors. These weren't clients who had been assigned to me through some corporate algorithm or random distribution system. These were people who had sought me out, who had left other firms to follow my recommendations, who trusted me with their children's college funds and their retirement dreams, and their family foundations that would outlive us all. I had earned that trust through 19 years of consistent performance, through late nights analyzing market trends and early mornings researching emerging opportunities, through the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had kept my clients' portfolios growing, even during the 2008 financial crisis, when other advisors were watching their recommendations crumble like sandcastles in a hurricane. While my colleagues were panicking and their clients were losing millions, I was finding opportunities in the chaos, identifying undervalued assets and positioning my portfolios for the recovery that I knew would eventually come. But none of that mattered to Marcus Wellington III, who had inherited his position as Chief Executive Officer 6 months ago when his father, Marcus Wellington Jr., suffered a massive heart attack on the golf course at his country club in Bellevue. The elder Wellington had built the firm from nothing, starting with a small investment advisory practice in the 1970s and growing it into one of the most respected financial institutions in the Pacific Northwest. He had been a mentor to me, someone who recognized talent regardless of where it came from or what family name was attached to it. His son, however, operated according to a completely different set of principles. Marcus III had spent his 20s bouncing between expensive private schools and exclusive European business programs, collecting degrees and connections but never developing the kind of practical expertise that actually served clients. He had joined Wellington Financial 5 years ago as a senior vice president, a position that typically required 15 years of experience and a proven track record of success, but which he had obtained through the simple accident of sharing DNA with the company's founder. Now, as I sat in that conference room listening to Marcus explain why my employment was being terminated, I couldn't help but remember the conversation I had overheard 6 weeks earlier in the executive break room. I had been working late, reviewing quarterly performance reports for my clients, when I heard voices coming from the kitchen area reserved for senior management. The door was slightly ajar, and I could clearly hear Marcus talking to his assistant, Bradley Morrison, about what he called his vision for modernizing the firm's operations. The changes he was proposing weren't really about modernization, though. They were about consolidation, about creating what he termed operational efficiency by reducing the number of individual client relationships and moving toward a more automated, algorithm-driven approach to investment management. In his vision, clients wouldn't work with specific advisors who understood their personal financial goals and risk tolerance. Instead, they would interact with a centralized team of analysts who would manage portfolios according to standardized models based on age, income, and investment timeline. It was exactly the kind of impersonal, corporate approach that had driven many of my clients to Wellington Financial in the first place. These were people who had worked with large investment banks and experienced the frustration of being treated like account numbers, rather than individuals with unique needs and circumstances. They valued the personal relationships they had built with their advisors, the trust that came from years of consistent communication and successful outcomes. But Marcus saw those relationships as inefficiencies that prevented the firm from scaling up to handle larger volumes of assets under management. He wanted to transform Wellington Financial from a boutique wealth management firm that prided itself on personalized service into something that resembled the massive investment houses, where clients were shuffled between anonymous representatives and their portfolios were managed according to generic formulas that maximized fees rather than returns. The irony was that my clients generated more revenue for Wellington Financial than any other advisor in the company's history. The fees from managing $1.2 billion in assets provided a significant portion of the firm's annual income, and my retention rate was higher than any other senior advisors, meaning that clients rarely left to work with competitors. From a purely business perspective, eliminating my position made absolutely no sense, unless the goal was something other than maximizing profitability and client satisfaction. That something else became clear as Marcus continued his explanation of why my services were no longer needed. According to him, the firm was moving toward a more collaborative approach to client management, where teams of analysts would share responsibility for portfolios rather than individual advisors maintaining exclusive relationships with specific clients. The transition would be seamless, he assured me, because the new system would provide clients with access to a broader range of expertise, rather than limiting them to the perspectives of a single advisor. The language was carefully chosen to make the changes sound like improvements, rather than cost-cutting measures disguised as innovation. But I had been in the financial services industry long enough to recognize corporate doublespeak when I heard it. What Marcus was really saying was that he wanted to eliminate the highest-paid positions at the firm and replace them with lower-cost analysts who could manage multiple portfolios simultaneously using software programs and standardized investment models. The fact that this approach would likely result in worse outcomes for clients didn't seem to concern him. His focus was on short-term cost reduction rather than long-term relationship building, on quarterly profit margins rather than the kind of sustained performance that had built Wellington Financial's reputation over decades. He was approaching wealth management like a manufacturing process, where efficiency meant standardization, and standardization meant eliminating the human expertise that actually created value for clients. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about Elena Rodriguez, one of my longest-standing clients, who had come to me 7 years ago after her previous advisor at a major investment bank had lost 30% of her retirement savings during a market downturn that should have been an opportunity for strategic repositioning rather than panic selling. Elena was a retired teacher who had spent 40 years saving money from her modest salary, investing every extra dollar with the dream of being able to travel during her retirement and leave something meaningful to her grandchildren. When she first walked into my office, she was understandably skeptical about trusting another financial advisor with her life savings. She had been burned before by someone who treated her portfolio like a collection of numbers, rather than understanding that every dollar represented months of careful budgeting and sacrifice. But over the years, we had built the kind of relationship that went beyond simple professional interaction. I knew that she preferred conservative investments that provided steady income over risky growth opportunities. I understood that her primary concern was preserving capital rather than maximizing returns, and I had structured her portfolio accordingly. The results spoke for themselves. Despite starting with a portfolio that had been devastated by poor advice and market timing, Elena's investments had grown consistently under my management. She was now able to take the trips she had dreamed about while knowing that her financial security was intact, and her grandchildren would inherit a substantial legacy. More importantly, she trusted me completely, calling me whenever she had concerns about market volatility or questions about financial planning strategies. That trust hadn't been built through marketing materials or corporate presentations. It had been earned through years of honest communication, through taking time to explain investment decisions in language she could understand, through being available when she needed reassurance during periods of market uncertainty. It was exactly the kind of personalized service that Marcus wanted to eliminate in favor of his automated, efficiency-driven approach. The same was true for David Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had sold his startup for $200 million and needed help managing sudden wealth that exceeded anything he had ever imagined. David's challenge wasn't finding investment opportunities. It was understanding the tax implications of different strategies, structuring his portfolio to provide long-term financial security while supporting the charitable foundation he wanted to establish, and navigating the complex world of estate planning that would protect his family's financial future. When David first came to Wellington Financial, he had interviewed several other advisors at larger firms who treated his wealth like an opportunity to sell expensive financial products rather than understanding his specific goals and values. They were more interested in managing as much of his money as possible than in developing strategies that aligned with his vision for how that money should be used. I had taken a completely different approach, spending hours learning about his background, his family situation, his philanthropic interests, and his concerns about the responsibility that came with significant wealth. Over the 3 years we had worked together, I had helped David structure investments that provided the income streams he needed, while positioning his portfolio for long-term growth that would support his foundation's work for decades to come. We had developed tax strategies that maximized his charitable giving while minimizing his family's financial obligations, and we had created estate planning structures that would ensure his wealth would benefit multiple generations while supporting causes he cared about. The relationship we had built was based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than simple financial transactions. David trusted my judgment because I had taken time to understand his goals and had consistently delivered results that exceeded his expectations. He valued my ability to explain complex financial concepts in straightforward terms and my willingness to challenge his assumptions when I thought better alternatives were available. But under Marcus's new system, David would become just another account number, managed by a team of analysts who would never understand his personal motivation or the unique circumstances that shaped his financial decisions. The personalized service that had attracted him to Wellington Financial would be replaced by generic investment models that treated all clients with similar asset levels as essentially interchangeable. The thought of explaining to Elena and David and my 45 other clients that I would no longer be managing their portfolios was almost physically painful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These weren't just professional relationships. They were partnerships built on trust, communication, and shared commitment to achieving financial goals that went far beyond simple wealth accumulation. My clients had chosen to work with me specifically because they valued the personal attention and customized strategies that larger firms couldn't or wouldn't provide. Marcus seemed completely oblivious to the human cost of his efficiency initiatives. From his perspective, client relationships were obstacles to operational scaling rather than the foundation of the firm's value proposition. He saw my expertise and client loyalty as problems to be solved rather than assets to be leveraged. His focus was on creating systems that could be managed by lower-cost employees rather than maintaining the kind of specialized knowledge that actually created superior outcomes for clients. The meeting was supposed to be a formality, a brief conversation, where I would be informed of the decision and given details about severance packages and transition timelines. But as Marcus continued explaining his vision for Wellington Financial's future, I realized that he had fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of wealth management and the source of his family's company's success. He was treating financial services like a commodity business, where the primary competitive advantage was low cost, rather than understanding that ultra-high net worth clients were willing to pay premium fees, precisely because they valued expertise, personalization, and relationship-based service. The irony was that his father had built Wellington Financial by providing exactly the kind of personalized service that Marcus now considered inefficient. The elder Wellington had understood that wealthy clients had options. They could work with any number of large investment banks or financial advisory firms, and that the only way to compete successfully was by offering something those larger institutions couldn't match. That something was the combination of sophisticated financial expertise and personal attention that came from working with senior advisors who had both the knowledge and the motivation to deliver exceptional results. Marcus Wellington III had apparently learned nothing from his father's success. Despite having access to decades of performance data that demonstrated the value of relationship-based wealth management, despite seeing how clients had consistently chosen Wellington Financial over larger competitors, specifically because of the personalized service they received, he was convinced that automation and standardization would somehow improve outcomes while reducing costs. The mathematical impossibility of his assumptions didn't seem to concern him. In financial services, as in most professional service industries, you typically couldn't reduce costs and improve quality simultaneously. Providing superior investment advice required significant expertise, extensive research, and ongoing communication with clients, all of which were expensive and time-consuming. Attempts to automate or standardize those processes inevitably resulted in lower quality outcomes, which might not be immediately visible, but would become apparent over time, as portfolios underperformed and clients became dissatisfied with impersonal service. But Marcus was focused on short-term financial metrics rather than long-term client satisfaction. He wanted to show improved profit margins in the next quarterly report, rather than building the kind of sustainable competitive advantages that would ensure Wellington Financial's success over decades. He was optimizing for immediate cost reduction rather than understanding that the firm's reputation and client relationships were its most valuable assets. As the meeting continued, I found myself wondering whether Marcus had bothered to review my performance metrics before deciding to terminate my employment. Over the 19 years I had worked at Wellington Financial, my clients' portfolios had consistently outperformed market benchmarks and the results achieved by other advisors both within the firm and at competing institutions. During periods of market volatility, my careful risk management had protected my clients from significant losses while positioning them to benefit from eventual recoveries. The numbers were objectively impressive. My clients' average annual returns exceeded the S&P 500 by 3.7 percentage points over the past decade, which represented tens of millions of dollars in additional wealth creation compared to what they would have achieved through passive index investing. More importantly, the consistency of those returns demonstrated that the outperformance wasn't due to lucky timing or excessive risk-taking, but rather to systematic application of sound investment principles and careful portfolio management. My client retention rate was 94%, meaning that fewer than 1 in 20 clients had chosen to work with other advisors during my tenure at Wellington Financial. The few departures that had occurred were due to major life changes like relocations to other countries or family situations that required different types of financial services, not dissatisfaction with investment performance or service quality. In an industry where client turnover was often seen as inevitable due to competing offers and changing preferences, that level of loyalty was almost unprecedented. But Marcus seemed more interested in my salary and bonus structure than in my performance metrics. As one of the firm's most senior advisors, I earned a base salary of $450,000 plus performance bonuses that typically added another $200,000 annually based on portfolio returns and client satisfaction measures. Those compensation levels reflected both the value I created for clients and the revenue I generated for Wellington Financial, but they also made me one of the highest paid employees in the company. From Marcus's perspective, eliminating my position would create immediate cost savings that could be reflected in improved quarterly profit margins. He could replace me with 2 or 3 junior analysts earning $70,000 each, creating the appearance of maintaining service levels while dramatically reducing compensation expenses. The fact that those junior analysts would lack the expertise and experience necessary to deliver comparable results apparently didn't factor into his calculations. The conversation had been going on for nearly 40 minutes when Marcus finally got to the practical details of my termination. I would be given 6 weeks severance pay, during which time I would be expected to transition my client relationships to other advisors within the firm, and complete documentation of my investment strategies and portfolio management processes. The transition period was presented as a generous gesture that would ensure continuity of service for my clients, but I recognized it for what it really was, an attempt to extract as much knowledge as possible from me before ending our professional relationship. The timeline was absurdly optimistic. 6 weeks wasn't nearly enough time to properly transfer relationships that had been built over years or decades, particularly given that many of my clients had specifically chosen to work with me rather than with Wellington Financial as an institution. These were people who valued personal connections and trusted my judgment about their financial futures. They weren't likely to accept being reassigned to junior advisors they had never met, regardless of how smooth Marcus imagined the transition process would be. I had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, listening to Marcus explain his vision for the firm's future and his rationale for eliminating my position. But as he outlined the transition timeline, and his expectations for how I would spend my final 6 weeks at Wellington Financial, I finally spoke up. I asked him whether he had discussed these changes with any of my clients, whether he understood that many of them had followed me from previous firms specifically because they valued working with me personally rather than with generic institutional advisory teams. His response revealed just how completely he had misunderstood the nature of wealth management relationships. According to Marcus, clients were primarily interested in investment performance rather than personal connections, and as long as the firm continued delivering strong returns, they would be satisfied regardless of which specific advisors were managing their portfolios. He seemed to believe that wealth management was essentially a numbers game, where relationships were secondary to mathematical results. The naivete of that assumption was staggering. While investment performance was certainly important to my clients, it wasn't the only factor that influenced their decisions about where to place their trust and their money. Ultra-high net worth individuals had access to sophisticated investment opportunities through multiple channels. They chose to work with specific advisors because they valued expertise, communication, and the peace of mind that came from knowing their financial futures were being managed by someone who understood their personal goals and concerns. Many of my clients had horror stories about previous experiences with large investment banks where they had been treated like account numbers rather than individuals. They had worked with advisors who disappeared during market downturns, who failed to return phone calls during periods of volatility, who recommended investment products that served the firm's interests rather than the client's needs. They had come to Wellington Financial specifically because they wanted to work with an advisor who would prioritize their financial success over short-term commission opportunities. That trust and loyalty couldn't be transferred to junior analysts through documentation and transition meetings. It had been earned through years of consistent performance, honest communication, and demonstrated commitment to putting clients' interests first. Marcus's assumption that those relationships could be seamlessly handed off to other advisors demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of why people chose to work with premium wealth management firms in the first place. But as I listened to him explain his transition plans, I realized that attempting to educate him about the realities of client relationship management would be pointless. He had already made his decision based on financial projections and operational efficiency models that treated human relationships as inconvenient variables, rather than recognizing them as the foundation of the firm's competitive advantage. He wasn't interested in understanding why his approach might be flawed. He was focused on implementing changes that would improve quarterly profit margins regardless of their long-term consequences. The meeting was clearly winding down as Marcus began outlining administrative details about returning company property, transferring client files, and completing final paperwork. But before we concluded, he made one final comment that revealed the true motivation behind his decision to terminate my employment. According to him, Wellington Financial needed to modernize its operations to compete effectively with larger institutions that could offer similar services at lower costs through automation and standardization. The comment demonstrated that he had completely misunderstood his firm's position in the marketplace. Wellington Financial didn't compete with large investment banks by offering lower costs. It competed by providing superior service, personalized attention, and the kind of relationship-based wealth management that larger institutions couldn't match. The firm's competitive advantage lay in its ability to deliver customized solutions and maintain long-term client relationships, not in operational efficiency or cost minimization. Trying to compete with Bank of America or Goldman Sachs on price was a strategy guaranteed to fail. Those institutions had vastly greater resources, more sophisticated technology platforms, and economies of scale that Wellington Financial could never match. The only way for a boutique wealth management firm to succeed was by offering something different and better, not something cheaper and more standardized. But Marcus seemed convinced that automation and operational efficiency were the keys to future success, despite having no evidence that such approaches would actually improve client outcomes or satisfaction. He was essentially proposing to abandon everything that had made Wellington Financial successful in favor of an unproven strategy that would transform the firm into a generic financial services provider competing in a market segment where it had no natural advantages. As I gathered my notes and prepared to leave the conference room, I found myself thinking about the conversation I would need to have with my clients over the next 6 weeks. These were people who had trusted me with their most important financial decisions, who had relied on my expertise to help them achieve goals that went far beyond simple wealth accumulation. They deserved to understand what was happening to their advisory relationships and what options were available to them going forward. The prospect of those conversations was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Many of my clients had become genuine friends over the years we had worked together. I had celebrated their successes, supported them through difficult periods, and helped them navigate major life transitions that required careful financial planning. The relationships we had built went far beyond simple professional interactions. They were partnerships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to achieving long-term financial security. But as I walked back to my office to begin the process of documenting my client relationships and investment strategies, I was also beginning to formulate a plan that would ensure my clients received the kind of service they deserved, regardless of Marcus Wellington III's misguided attempts to modernize his father's company. The next 6 weeks would be about much more than transitioning client files and completing paperwork. They would be about protecting relationships that had taken years to build and ensuring that my clients' financial futures remained secure despite the upheaval that was about to reshape Wellington Financial's operations. The view from my office window looked the same as it had that morning when I arrived, for what I thought would be another routine day of managing portfolios and communicating with clients. But everything had changed in the span of a single meeting. The career I had built over 19 years at Wellington Financial was ending, but the relationships I had developed with clients who controlled over $1 billion in assets were just beginning a new chapter. Marcus Wellington III had made the biggest mistake of his privileged life, though he wouldn't understand the magnitude of that error until it was far too late to correct it. The next morning, I sat in my office staring at the list of 47 phone numbers that represented the most important conversations of my professional life. Each name on that list corresponded to a client who had entrusted me with their financial future, and now I had to tell them that Wellington Financial Group was essentially firing their chosen advisor in favor of a team-based approach that prioritized cost reduction over personalized service. The weight of those pending conversations felt heavier than any market crash or financial crisis I had navigated in my 19-year career. I decided to start with Elena Rodriguez, partly because she had been one of my first major clients, and partly because I knew she would appreciate direct, honest communication, rather than corporate euphemisms designed to minimize the impact of what was happening. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth that had made our professional relationship evolve into something approaching genuine friendship over the 7 years we had worked together. After exchanging pleasantries about her recent trip to Portugal and her granddaughter's acceptance to medical school, I explained what had happened in yesterday's meeting with Marcus Wellington III. I told her about the firm's new direction toward automated portfolio management and team-based client service, and I watched through my office window as a ferry crossed Elliott Bay, while I waited for her response to what I knew would be devastating news. The silence that followed was longer than I had expected, and when Elena finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of anger and disbelief that surprised me with its intensity. She told me that she had specifically chosen to work with me rather than with Wellington Financial as an institution, and that the idea of having her retirement savings managed by a team of junior analysts she had never met was completely unacceptable. Her trust was in me personally, not in the company's brand name or technological systems. What Elena said next revealed something I hadn't fully anticipated. She asked me directly whether I would be starting my own advisory firm, and when I told her that I hadn't yet decided on my next steps, she made it clear that she would be moving her entire portfolio wherever I chose to go. According to her, the 7 years we had worked together had been the most successful period in her investment history, and she wasn't about to risk her financial security by working with advisors who didn't understand her conservative approach and income-focused strategy. The conversation with Elena lasted nearly an hour, during which she shared her thoughts about Marcus Wellington III's leadership and her concerns about what his changes meant for Wellington Financial's future. She had met him briefly at a client appreciation event 6 months earlier, and had been unimpressed by his superficial understanding of wealth management and his obvious lack of interest in actually connecting with clients. According to Elena, he had spent most of that event talking about technological innovations and operational efficiency, rather than discussing investment strategies or market outlook. Her assessment of Marcus was harsher than anything I would have said professionally, but it was also remarkably accurate. Elena had built a successful career as an educator by developing strong instincts about people's character and competence, and she had clearly identified Marcus as someone who lacked both the expertise and the genuine commitment to client service that wealth management required. She viewed his decision to eliminate experienced advisors as confirmation of what she had suspected about his priorities and judgment. After ending the call with Elena, I immediately dialed David Chen's number, knowing that his response would be equally important given the size of his portfolio and his influence within Seattle's tech community. David was in a board meeting when I called, but his assistant arranged for him to call me back within the hour, which gave me time to prepare for what I knew would be a more complex conversation than the one I had just finished with Elena. When David returned my call, I could hear the background noise of his downtown office, where he was building his charitable foundation while managing the various business interests that had grown out of his successful startup exit. I explained the situation at Wellington Financial with the same directness I had used with Elena, focusing on the practical implications of the firm's new approach, rather than my personal feelings about being terminated after nearly 2 decades of service. David's response was immediate and unequivocal. He told me that he had chosen to work with me specifically because of my expertise in managing substantial wealth transitions, and my understanding of the tax and estate planning complexities that came with his financial situation. The idea of working with a team of junior analysts who lacked experience with high-net-worth financial planning was not just unappealing to him, it was potentially dangerous given the sophisticated strategies we had developed for his portfolio and foundation. What David said next completely changed my understanding of what the next phase of my career might look like. He told me that he had been considering for some time whether to establish his own family office to manage his investments and foundation assets, but had been hesitant to take on the complexity and overhead that such an operation would require. However, if I were interested in leading such an effort, he would be willing to provide the initial funding and infrastructure necessary to create a truly independent wealth management firm. The offer was both generous and strategically brilliant. A family office structure would allow us to provide the kind of personalized, relationship-based service that Marcus Wellington III was eliminating at Wellington Financial, while also creating a platform that could eventually serve other ultra-high-net-worth clients who valued expertise and personal attention over cost minimization and operational efficiency. David's foundation work had already connected him with other wealthy individuals who were frustrated with the impersonal service they received from large investment banks and institutional advisory firms. Our conversation continued for nearly 2 hours as David outlined his vision for what such a family office might look like, and how it could evolve into a boutique wealth management firm that served clients who prioritized results and relationships over fees and convenience. He had clearly been thinking about these issues for some time, and my termination from Wellington Financial had simply provided the catalyst necessary to move from theoretical planning to practical implementation. The structure David proposed was elegant in its simplicity. He would provide the initial capitalization for a new advisory firm, along with office space in his downtown building, and access to the technological infrastructure necessary for sophisticated portfolio management and client communication. In return, I would serve as the firm's chief investment officer and lead advisor, bringing my expertise and client relationships to create what would essentially be a premium alternative to the cookie-cutter approach that was becoming increasingly common in the wealth management industry. More importantly, David's proposal addressed the regulatory and operational challenges that would otherwise make starting an independent advisory firm extremely difficult and expensive. Establishing the necessary compliance systems, technology platforms, and administrative support would typically require millions of dollars in initial investment and months of regulatory approvals. By partnering with David's existing family office infrastructure, we could begin serving clients almost immediately while building toward eventual independence and expansion. After ending the call with David, I spent the rest of the morning thinking about the implications of what he had proposed and how it might affect my other client relationships. The possibility of maintaining continuity of service while actually improving the level of personal attention and customized strategies I could provide was incredibly appealing, especially compared to the prospect of starting over at another large advisory firm, where I would likely face similar pressures for operational efficiency and cost reduction. The afternoon brought calls to 12 more clients, each of whom expressed similar frustration with Wellington Financial's new direction, and similar interest in following me to whatever firm I chose to join next. The consistency of their responses was both gratifying and revelatory. These weren't just professional relationships based on investment performance. They were partnerships built on trust, communication, and shared commitment to achieving long-term financial goals that went far beyond simple wealth accumulation. Rebecca Thompson, who had inherited a substantial portfolio from her late husband and relied on my guidance to navigate the complex world of wealth management while grieving his loss, told me that the idea of working with strangers at Wellington Financial was emotionally impossible. The relationship we had built over the 4 years since her husband's death had been based on understanding her unique situation and providing not just financial advice but also the kind of patient, compassionate communication that helped her make difficult decisions during an incredibly challenging period of her life. Robert Kim, whose technology consulting firm had generated significant wealth over the past decade, expressed similar sentiments about the value of personalized service and long-term relationships in wealth management. He had worked with 3 different advisory firms before joining Wellington Financial specifically to work with me, and he had no interest in repeating the frustrating experience of constantly having to re-explain his financial goals and risk tolerance to new advisors who treated his portfolio like a collection of numbers rather than understanding the personal and business factors that influenced his investment decisions. The pattern continued through every conversation I had that day. Client after client expressed frustration with Marcus Wellington III's direction for the firm, and made it clear that their loyalty was to me personally rather than to Wellington Financial as an institution. Several clients mentioned that they had already been contacted by other advisory firms, trying to capitalize on the uncertainty created by news of my departure, but they were waiting to see what I decided to do before making any changes to their current arrangements. By the end of the day, I had spoken with 23 of my 47 clients, and every single one had indicated that they would prefer to move their assets to whatever firm I joined rather than remain at Wellington Financial under the new team-based management structure. The vote of confidence was both humbling and empowering, confirming that the relationships I had built over nearly 2 decades were genuine partnerships rather than simple business transactions. That evening, I called David Chen to discuss the practical details of his family office proposal and to share the results of my conversations with other clients. He listened carefully as I described the unanimous support I had received and the clear indication that virtually all of my clients would be willing to transfer their assets to a new advisory firm if the service quality and investment expertise met their expectations. David's response exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Based on what I had told him about client reactions, he was willing to accelerate the timeline for establishing our new firm and to provide additional resources for technology infrastructure and compliance systems that would allow us to serve a larger client base from the beginning. He had also spoken with his attorney about the regulatory requirements for establishing an independent advisory firm, and the process was more straightforward than either of us had initially anticipated. More significantly, David had reached out to several contacts in Seattle's business community who had expressed frustration with their current advisory relationships and interest in working with a firm that prioritized personalized service over operational efficiency. The word was already spreading through networks of wealthy individuals that an alternative to large institutional wealth management might soon be available, and the initial response was overwhelmingly positive. Our conversation that evening lasted nearly 3 hours as we discussed everything from office locations and staffing requirements to fee structures and client communication systems. David's business experience and my financial expertise created a natural partnership that addressed both the strategic vision and practical implementation challenges that would determine whether our new firm could succeed in competing with established institutional players. The most important decision we made that evening was about timing. Rather than waiting until my 6-week transition period at Wellington Financial was complete, we would begin the process of establishing our new firm immediately. David's legal team would handle the regulatory filings and compliance requirements, while I continued documenting my investment strategies and client relationships at Wellington Financial. The goal was to be ready to begin serving clients within 4 weeks, which would minimize the disruption to their portfolios and demonstrate our commitment to maintaining the high level of service they had come to expect. The next morning brought a surprise that confirmed my growing suspicion that Marcus Wellington III had fundamentally misunderstood both the wealth management industry and his own firm's competitive position. Bradley Morrison, his assistant and apparent strategic advisor, had scheduled meetings with my 3 largest clients to discuss what he called their transition to the new advisory team structure. According to the calendar appointments I could see in the firm's shared system, Bradley was planning to meet with Elena Rodriguez, David Chen, and Rebecca Thompson, to reassure them about the continuity of service they would receive under Wellington Financial's modernized operations. The hubris required to believe that junior staff members could successfully manage relationships with ultra-high-net-worth clients who had specifically chosen to work with senior advisors was breathtaking. Bradley Morrison was a recent MBA graduate with no practical experience in wealth management, no understanding of the complex financial strategies required for sophisticated portfolios, and no established relationships with any of Wellington Financial's clients. The idea that he could effectively communicate with people who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets was absurd on multiple levels. But the meetings also represented an opportunity that I hadn't anticipated. By attempting to manage my client relationships directly, Marcus and Bradley were essentially forcing those clients to make immediate decisions about whether they valued their relationships with me enough to leave Wellington Financial. Instead of allowing the transition to happen gradually over 6 weeks, they were accelerating the timeline and creating a clear choice between staying with the firm under new management or following me to whatever alternative I could provide. I spent that morning preparing detailed transition documents for each of my major clients, including comprehensive summaries of their current portfolio positions, investment strategies, and long-term financial plans. The documents were ostensibly being created to facilitate smooth handoffs to the new advisory team, but they would also serve as the foundation for continuing those relationships at our new firm if clients chose to make that move. The level of detail required for proper documentation was staggering. Each client's file contained years of correspondence about investment decisions, market analysis, tax planning strategies, and estate planning considerations. The portfolios I managed weren't simple collections of stocks and bonds. They were sophisticated financial structures designed to achieve specific goals while managing risk and optimizing tax efficiency. Replicating that level of customization and expertise would require far more time and knowledge than Marcus seemed to understand. Bradley Morrison's first meeting was scheduled with Elena Rodriguez at 10 o'clock, and I made sure to be available by phone in case she needed any clarification about her portfolio or the transition process. I didn't have to wait long. Elena called me at 10:45, and her tone made it immediately clear that the meeting had not gone according to Bradley's plans. According to Elena, Bradley had spent most of the meeting reading from prepared talking points about Wellington Financial's new approach to client service and the benefits of working with advisory teams rather than individual advisors. When she had asked specific questions about her portfolio's current asset allocation and the reasoning behind recent investment decisions, he had been unable to provide meaningful answers and had suggested that those details would be handled by the analytical team that would be assigned to her account. The conversation had deteriorated further when Elena had asked about her income-focused investment strategy and how the new team approach would ensure consistency with her conservative risk tolerance and need for reliable quarterly distributions. Bradley had responded with generic information about modern portfolio theory and asset allocation models, demonstrating that he had no understanding of her specific situation or the customized approach we had developed for her portfolio over 7 years of working together. Elena's frustration was evident as she described how Bradley had dismissed her concerns about working with advisors she had never met and didn't trust. According to him, client relationships were less important than investment performance, and the firm's new systems would deliver superior results through better analytical tools and more sophisticated modeling techniques. The suggestion that technology could replace the human judgment and personal understanding that had guided her investment decisions for years was both insulting and frightening to someone who valued conservative, relationship-based wealth management. The final straw had come when Elena had asked about the timeline for transferring her account to the new advisory team and whether she would have any opportunity to meet the analysts who would be making decisions about her financial future. Bradley had told her that client meetings were generally unnecessary under the new system because portfolio management would be handled through automated processes and standardized communication protocols. The idea that her retirement security would be managed by people she would never meet using systems she didn't understand was completely unacceptable to her. Elena ended our conversation by asking me to begin the paperwork necessary to transfer her entire portfolio to whatever firm I would be joining. She had no interest in remaining at Wellington Financial under any circumstances, regardless of what promises Marcus and Bradley might make about service quality or investment performance. Her trust was in me personally, and she was willing to move her assets wherever necessary to maintain that relationship. The pattern was repeated when David Chen called me after his meeting with Bradley Morrison that afternoon. David's assessment of Bradley's competence was even harsher than Elena's, partly because his technology background had given him sophisticated understanding of both analytical systems and human performance factors. According to David, Bradley had demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of the tax and estate planning strategies that were central to his portfolio management, and his suggestions for improving the current approach would have created significant tax liabilities and compliance problems. More troubling to David was Bradley's apparent belief that wealthy clients were primarily motivated by investment returns, rather than comprehensive financial planning that addressed their complex personal and business situations. The reduction of wealth management to simple performance metrics ignored the reality that ultra-high net worth individuals needed sophisticated strategies for tax optimization, estate planning, charitable giving, and risk management that went far beyond basic asset allocation and security selection. David's conversation with Bradley had also revealed the superficial nature of Marcus Wellington III's understanding of his own clients and their needs. Bradley had referred to David as a typical tech entrepreneur who would benefit from more aggressive growth strategies that took advantage of his, quote, high risk tolerance and long investment timeline. The characterization was completely wrong on every level and demonstrated that Marcus's team had never bothered to understand David's actual financial situation or investment objectives. The reality was that David's wealth management needs were extraordinarily complex, involving coordination between his personal investments, foundation assets, business interests, and estate planning strategies that would affect multiple generations of his family. The customized approach we had developed over 3 years of working together addressed all of those factors in an integrated way that maximized tax efficiency while supporting his philanthropic goals and providing long-term financial security for his family. Bradley's suggestion that David's portfolio could be improved through standardized growth models and, quote, automated rebalancing systems demonstrated complete ignorance of the sophisticated strategies required for his situation. The idea that software programs could replace the human expertise necessary for complex wealth management was exactly the kind of dangerous oversimplification that drove sophisticated clients away from large institutional firms in the first place. David ended our conversation by confirming that he wanted to accelerate our timeline for establishing the new advisory firm. Based on his meeting with Bradley Morrison, he was convinced that Marcus Wellington III's approach would not just fail to serve existing clients effectively, it would actively damage their financial interests through incompetent management and inappropriate strategies. The urgency of providing an alternative had increased dramatically as the scope of Wellington Financial's problems became clear. That evening, I received calls from 6 more clients who had been contacted by Wellington Financial staff about their transition to the new advisory structure. Every conversation followed the same pattern: initial confusion about why they were being assigned to new advisors, growing frustration with the junior staff members' inability to answer basic questions about their portfolios, and ultimate determination to follow me wherever I decided to continue my career. The consistency of their reactions was both validating and sobering. These were sophisticated individuals who understood the complexities of wealth management and recognized competence when they encountered it. Their unanimous rejection of Wellington Financial's new approach wasn't based on personal loyalty alone. It was based on their assessment that the firm's direction represented a fundamental threat to their financial security and long-term investment success. Margaret Foster, whose family trust had been built over 3 generations and required extremely careful management to balance current income needs with long-term preservation goals, told me that her meeting with Wellington's new advisory team had been the most frustrating hour of my professional life. The junior analysts assigned to her account had suggested simplifying her complex trust structure through modern investment vehicles that would have destroyed decades of careful tax planning and potentially violated the fiduciary obligations established by her grandparent. William Chen, David's cousin who managed a substantial portfolio built through real estate development, had similar concerns about Wellington Financial's new approach. His investments required constant attention to market timing, tax implications, and coordination with his business activities. The idea that those decisions could be handled through automated systems and standardized models was not just unrealistic, it was potentially catastrophic given the size and complexity of his holdings. The unanimous response from my clients created both an opportunity and an obligation. On one hand, their willingness to follow me to a new firm provided the foundation for what could become a highly successful independent advisory business, serving ultra-high net worth individuals who valued expertise and personalized service. On the other hand, their trust in my judgment meant that I had a responsibility to ensure that whatever alternative I provided would actually deliver the superior service and investment results they expected. The pressure to make the right decision about my next career move was enormous. These weren't just clients. They were people who had entrusted me with their financial futures and who were now depending on me to protect their interests during a period of significant uncertainty. The wrong choice could potentially harm not just my own career prospects, but also the financial security of families who had relied on my expertise for years or even decades. That night, I spent hours reviewing financial projections for David Chen's proposed family office structure and considering whether it could realistically provide the level of service and expertise that my clients deserved. The numbers were encouraging, but the practical challenges of starting an independent firm while maintaining continuity of service for existing relationships were substantial. Success would require flawless execution during a transition period that left no room for errors or delays. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Marcus Wellington III had essentially forced a choice between accepting the degradation of client service at Wellington Financial or taking the risk of building something better from scratch. The decision would determine not just my own professional future, but also the financial security of 47 families who had trusted me with over $1 billion in assets. The next few weeks would prove whether that trust had been well placed and whether relationship-based wealth management could successfully compete with the automated, efficiency-focused approach that was becoming increasingly common in the financial services industry. My phone rang at 11:30 that night with a call from James Rodriguez, Elena's son, who had heard about the situation at Wellington Financial from his mother and wanted to understand what was happening to her investment advisory relationship. James was a successful attorney in San Francisco who had been involved in reviewing his mother's financial planning documents and understood the sophistication of the strategies we had developed for her portfolio. The conversation with James lasted over an hour and provided another perspective on what Marcus Wellington III's changes meant for Wellington Financial's clients and reputation. According to James, word was already spreading through professional networks in San Francisco and Seattle about the upheaval at Wellington Financial and the potential impact on client relationships. Several of his colleagues who worked with high net worth individuals had mentioned the situation as an example of what happened when financial firms prioritized cost reduction over service quality. James also confirmed something I had suspected but hadn't been able to verify. Other advisory firms were already reaching out to Wellington Financial's clients with offers to manage their portfolios during the transition period. The disruption Marcus had created by eliminating experienced advisors was being seen by competitors as an opportunity to acquire valuable client relationships that might otherwise have remained inaccessible. The competitive threat was real and immediate. If I couldn't provide a compelling alternative quickly enough, my clients might be forced to work with other firms simply because they needed continuity of service for their portfolios. The 6-week transition timeline that had seemed generous when Marcus first announced it was beginning to look dangerously long given the pace at which events were unfolding. But James's call also provided crucial information about the regulatory and practical requirements for establishing an independent advisory firm. His law practice included several clients who had made similar transitions from large institutions to boutique firms, and he was familiar with the compliance and operational challenges that would need to be addressed. More importantly, he offered to help facilitate the legal and regulatory aspects of establishing our new firm if it would help protect his mother's financial interests. The offer of legal assistance from someone with relevant experience was invaluable, but it also represented another vote of confidence from a family that had entrusted me with their financial future. James's willingness to invest his own time and expertise in helping establish our new firm demonstrated the level of trust and support that existed among my client families. They weren't just passive recipients of advisory services. They were active partners who were willing to contribute to solutions that would benefit everyone involved. As I finally prepared for bed after nearly 16 hours of client conversations and strategic planning, I reflected on how completely my professional situation had changed in just 48 hours. What had started as a devastating termination from a firm where I had spent my entire career was evolving into an opportunity to build something better and more aligned with my values and expertise. The road ahead would be challenging and uncertain, but it would also be entirely under my control for the first time in my professional life. Instead of operating within the constraints and limitations imposed by Marcus Wellington III's misguided vision for operational efficiency, I would be able to focus entirely on delivering the kind of personalized, expert service that my clients deserved and that had made my career successful in the first place. The next morning would bring more client conversations, more planning meetings with David Chen, and more preparation for what was beginning to look like the most important career transition of my life. But for the first time since sitting in that conference room listening to Marcus explain why my services were no longer needed, I felt optimistic about the future and confident that the relationships I had built over 19 years would prove stronger than the institutional loyalties that Marcus had taken for granted. The third day after my termination brought an unexpected development that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of my departure from Wellington Financial Group. I arrived at my office early, as had become my habit over 19 years, to find an urgent message from Jennifer Walsh, the firm's chief operating officer, requesting an immediate meeting. Jennifer had always maintained a professional relationship with me, but we had never been particularly close, so her request for an urgent discussion suggested that something significant had changed overnight. Jennifer's office was located on the 44th floor, 2 levels above mine, in a corner suite that overlooked both Elliott Bay and the Cascade Mountains. The view was spectacular, but Jennifer seemed too agitated to appreciate it as she paced behind her desk while waiting for me to arrive. Her usually impeccable professional demeanor appeared strained, and she was holding a thick folder of documents that I suspected contained information about client reactions to my termination. The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which Marcus Wellington III had miscalculated the impact of his decision to eliminate my position. According to Jennifer, the firm had received 17 formal requests for asset transfers in the past 24 hours, representing over $400 million in client assets that would be leaving Wellington Financial if the transfers were completed. The requests had come from some of my most substantial clients, including Elena Rodriguez, David Chen, Rebecca Thompson, and several others who had made it clear that their loyalty was to me personally rather than to the firm. But the asset transfer requests were only part of the problem Jennifer was facing. She had also received numerous phone calls from clients expressing frustration with the quality of service they were receiving from the junior staff members who had been assigned to manage their accounts during the transition period. Several clients had specifically complained about Bradley Morrison's incompetence and his failure to understand even basic aspects of their investment strategies and financial planning needs. More troubling from Jennifer's perspective was the fact that news of the client departures was already spreading through Seattle's business community. Wellington Financial's reputation had been built on client retention and personalized service, and the sudden exodus of high-net-worth clients was creating questions about the firm's stability and management competence. Jennifer had fielded calls from 3 different business journalists who were investigating the story and asking pointed questions about the firm's new direction under Marcus Wellington III's leadership. The regulatory implications were equally concerning. As Chief Operating Officer, Jennifer was responsible for ensuring that Wellington Financial complied with all applicable securities laws and regulatory requirements, including proper handling of client assets during advisory relationship transitions. The volume and speed of transfer requests was creating operational challenges that could potentially result in compliance violations if not managed carefully. Jennifer's primary concern, however, was what she described as a complete breakdown in communication between Marcus Wellington III and the firm's client base. According to her, Marcus had refused to acknowledge that his decision to eliminate experienced advisors was causing the client departures, instead insisting that the transfers were temporary reactions that would resolve themselves once clients experienced the benefits of the new team-based approach. His denial of the obvious connection between my termination and the asset transfers was creating a crisis of confidence among Wellington Financial's remaining senior staff members. Several other advisors had approached Jennifer privately to express concerns about their own job security and the firm's future direction. If Marcus was willing to eliminate someone with my track record and client relationships, no one felt safe from similar treatment. Jennifer's request for our meeting became clear as she outlined the full scope of the crisis that was developing. She wanted me to consider delaying my departure from Wellington Financial in order to help manage the transition period and prevent further client defections. According to her analysis, the firm could potentially lose over $800 million in assets under management if the current trend continued, which would represent a devastating blow to Wellington Financial's revenue and market position. The irony of her request was striking. Less than 72 hours after Marcus Wellington III had told me that my services were no longer needed, his chief operating officer was asking me to help save the firm from the consequences of his decision. The reversal demonstrated just how completely Marcus had misunderstood both the nature of wealth management relationships and the source of Wellington Financial's competitive advantages. But Jennifer's proposal was more sophisticated than a simple request for me to remain at the firm. She had apparently been developing contingency plans for managing the crisis that Marcus's leadership decisions were creating, and those plans included the possibility of restructuring my role to provide greater autonomy and independence while maintaining my client relationships under Wellington Financial's regulatory umbrella. The structure she outlined was essentially a firm-within-a-firm arrangement that would allow me to operate with minimal oversight while sharing revenue with Wellington Financial in exchange for compliance support, technology infrastructure, and administrative services. The proposal would address many of the concerns I had about Marcus's micromanagement style, while preserving the client relationships that were clearly more valuable to the firm than anyone had realized. Jennifer's analysis of the financial implications was particularly compelling. The revenue generated by my client relationships represented approximately 30% of Wellington Financial's total income, and the loss of those relationships would require dramatic cost reductions throughout the organization to maintain profitability. The resulting layoffs and service cuts would likely trigger additional client departures, creating a downward spiral that could threaten the firm's long-term viability. More importantly, Jennifer understood something that Marcus apparently did not. The wealth management industry was fundamentally relationship-based, and those relationships could not be transferred or replicated through operational efficiency improvements. Clients chose to work with specific advisors because they trusted their judgment and valued their expertise, not because they were impressed by the firm's technological capabilities or cost structure. Her proposal represented a recognition that Wellington Financial's value proposition was built on the human capital and client relationships that Marcus was systematically destroying through his modernization efforts. By creating a structure that preserved those relationships while addressing the operational concerns that drove his decision-making, Jennifer was essentially offering a compromise that could benefit everyone involved. But the conversation with Jennifer also revealed additional information about Marcus Wellington III's leadership style and decision-making process that made me question whether any compromise would be sustainable long-term. According to Jennifer, Marcus had become increasingly isolated from both clients and staff since assuming the CEO position, preferring to make decisions based on financial projections and consulting reports rather than seeking input from people with practical experience in wealth management. His apparent belief that client relationships were impediments to operational efficiency rather than valuable assets demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the business his father had built. Marcus seemed to view Wellington Financial as a technology company that happened to provide financial services, rather than as a relationship-based advisory firm that used technology to support personalized client service. Jennifer's frustration with Marcus's leadership was evident as she described his response to the client transfer requests and staff concerns about the firm's direction. Instead of acknowledging that his decisions might have been premature or poorly implemented, he had doubled down on his commitment to operational modernization and suggested that anyone who disagreed with his vision was resistant to necessary change. The stubbornness that Jennifer described was consistent with what I had observed during my termination meeting, but it was also deeply concerning given the scope of the crisis that was developing. A CEO who refused to acknowledge problems or adjust strategies based on feedback was likely to make additional mistakes that would compound the damage already being done to Wellington Financial's client relationships and market reputation. As our conversation continued, Jennifer shared additional details about the internal dynamics at Wellington Financial that had contributed to Marcus's decision to eliminate my position. According to her, he had been under pressure from the firm's board of directors to improve profitability and reduce operational costs in order to position Wellington Financial for potential acquisition by a larger financial services company. The revelation that Marcus might be preparing to sell Wellington Financial explained many of his decisions that had seemed inexplicable from a client service perspective. If his goal was to maximize short-term profitability in preparation for a sale, then reducing compensation costs and standardizing operations would make the firm more attractive to potential buyers, even if those changes degraded service quality and damaged client relationships. But Jennifer's analysis suggested that Marcus's strategy was fundamentally flawed even from an acquisition perspective. Financial services companies were typically valued based on their assets under management and client retention rates, rather than their operational efficiency or cost structure. The client departures that were resulting from his management decisions would actually make Wellington Financial less attractive to potential acquirers, not more valuable. The conversation with Jennifer lasted nearly 3 hours as we discussed various options for addressing the crisis while protecting both client interests and the firm's long-term viability. Her proposal for restructuring my role was thoughtful and comprehensive, but it also required Marcus Wellington III's approval, which seemed unlikely given his apparent commitment to his current course of action. More fundamentally, I was beginning to question whether remaining at Wellington Financial in any capacity would be in the best interests of my clients. The firm's culture and strategic direction were clearly changing in ways that prioritized cost reduction over service quality, and those changes would likely continue regardless of what accommodation might be reached regarding my specific situation. After leaving Jennifer's office, I spent the remainder of the morning reviewing the legal documents that David Chen's attorney had prepared for establishing our independent advisory firm. The regulatory approval process was proceeding more quickly than we had initially expected, and we were on track to begin serving clients within 2 weeks rather than the 4 weeks we had originally projected. The accelerated timeline was partly due to David's connections within Seattle's business community and his attorney's experience with similar transitions, but it was also a response to the urgency created by Wellington Financial's deteriorating situation. Several of my clients had called to express concerns about the delays in processing their transfer requests and the quality of interim service they were receiving from Wellington's junior staff. The most significant development was a call from Patricia Williams, who managed the investment committee for a family foundation that controlled over $200 million in assets. Patricia had been working with me for 12 years, and her foundation's portfolio was one of the most complex and carefully structured relationships in my client base due to the specific requirements for charitable giving and tax optimization that governed foundation investments. Patricia's call was prompted by a meeting she had been required to attend with Wellington Financial's new analytical team, during which she had been told that her foundation's investment strategy was unnecessarily complicated and could be simplified through standardized portfolio models that would reduce management fees and improve operational efficiency. The suggestion that decades of careful estate planning and tax optimization could be replaced with generic investment templates was both insulting and potentially disastrous for the foundation's mission and compliance requirements. More troubling was the team's apparent lack of understanding of the regulatory environment that governed foundation investments and their suggestion that certain portfolio positions should be liquidated to improve diversification metrics. The recommended changes would have created significant tax liabilities and potentially violated the fiduciary obligations that Patricia had to the foundation's board of directors and beneficiaries. Patricia's frustration was compounded by the team's inability to answer basic questions about the reasoning behind current portfolio positions, and their apparent unfamiliarity with the foundation's specific investment policy and spending requirements. The analysts assigned to her account had clearly received minimal training in the specialized knowledge required for foundation portfolio management, and their generic approach to wealth management was completely inappropriate for her situation. The conversation with Patricia reinforced my growing conviction that remaining at Wellington Financial would be impossible, even under the restructured arrangement that Jennifer Walsh had proposed. The firm's commitment to standardized, cost-effective service delivery was fundamentally incompatible with the personalized expertise that sophisticated clients required, and Marcus Wellington III's leadership style made it unlikely that meaningful changes would be implemented. That afternoon brought additional confirmation of Wellington Financial's declining situation, when I received a call from Michael Torres, a business journalist with the Seattle Business Journal, who was investigating the client departures and their implications for the firm's future. Michael had apparently spoken with several of my former clients who had agreed to discuss their experiences with Wellington Financial's new advisory approach, and their comments were uniformly negative. According to Michael, the story he was preparing would focus on the broader trend toward automation and cost reduction in wealth management, and whether those changes were actually benefiting clients or simply improving profit margins for financial services companies. Wellington Financial was being featured as a case study in what happened when firms prioritized operational efficiency over relationship-based service, and the client feedback he had received suggested that the results were predictably poor. Michael's questions about my own experience at Wellington Financial were carefully phrased to avoid potential legal issues, but they clearly indicated that he understood the connection between my termination and the subsequent client departures. He was particularly interested in my perspective on whether the trend toward automated portfolio management was driven by genuine technological improvements or simply by companies' desire to reduce compensation costs for experienced advisors. The conversation with Michael lasted nearly an hour and provided additional insight into how Wellington Financial's situation was being perceived within Seattle's business community. According to him, several other wealth management firms were already reaching out to Wellington's clients, with offers to provide the kind of personalized service that was apparently no longer available under Marcus Wellington III's new operational model. The competitive threat was real and immediate, but it also represented validation of the value proposition that David Chen and I were developing for our independent advisory firm. If established competitors were recognizing opportunities to attract Wellington Financial's clients, it suggested that there was significant demand for relationship-based wealth management services that prioritized expertise and personalization over cost minimization. That evening, I met with David Chen and his attorney to finalize the operational details for our new firm and review the client transition procedures that would ensure continuity of service during the changeover. The meeting was held in David's downtown office, a sleek space that reflected both his success in the technology industry and his commitment to supporting innovative business ventures. David's enthusiasm for our partnership had grown as the scope of Wellington Financial's problems became clear. He viewed the crisis that Marcus Wellington III had created as confirmation that the wealth management industry was ready for disruption by firms that genuinely prioritize client service over operational efficiency. Our independent advisory firm would serve as a demonstration that relationship-based financial planning could successfully compete with the automated, standardized approaches that larger institutions were adopting. The financial projections for our new firm were extraordinarily promising. Based on the client commitments I had already received, we would begin operations with over $800 million in assets under management, which would make us one of the largest independent advisory firms in the Pacific Northwest from the day we opened our doors. The revenue generated by those assets would provide more than sufficient resources for hiring additional staff, investing in technology infrastructure, and expanding our client base through referrals and marketing efforts. More importantly, the fee structure we had developed would actually reduce costs for most of my former Wellington Financial clients, while providing them with a higher level of personalized service than they had received under the firm's traditional model. By eliminating the overhead costs and profit margins that large institutional firms required, we could offer premium wealth management services at prices that were competitive with automated investment platforms, while maintaining the human expertise and relationship focus that sophisticated clients valued. The meeting with David also addressed the strategic vision for our firm's long-term development and growth. While our initial focus would be on serving the clients who were transferring from Wellington Financial, we plan to gradually expand our capabilities to include specialized services like family office management, philanthropic planning, and multi-generational wealth transfer strategies that were underserved by most existing advisory firms. David's connections within Seattle's technology community provided additional opportunities for business development among entrepreneurs and executives who had generated significant wealth but lacked access to sophisticated financial planning expertise. Many of these potential clients had been frustrated by their experiences with large investment banks that treated technology wealth differently from inherited or traditional business wealth, often with disappointing results. Our conversation continued late into the evening as we discussed everything from office space and staffing requirements to marketing strategies and client communication systems. David's business experience and my financial expertise created a natural partnership that addressed both the strategic vision and practical implementation challenges that would determine whether our new firm could deliver on its promise of superior client service. The most significant decision we made that evening was about transparency and communication with our prospective clients. Rather than trying to minimize the disruption caused by leaving Wellington Financial, we would be completely open about our reasons for establishing an independent firm and our commitment to providing better service than what was available through traditional institutional channels. The approach was risky because it required us to explicitly criticize Wellington Financial's new direction and Marcus Wellington III's leadership decisions. But it was also authentic and aligned with the values that had guided my career in wealth management. Our clients deserved honest communication about the challenges facing the industry and the alternatives available to them, even if that honesty made our transition more complicated from a business development perspective. The next morning brought news that confirmed the wisdom of our decision to establish an independent alternative to Wellington Financial's deteriorating service model. Jennifer Walsh called to inform me that Marcus Wellington III had rejected her proposal for restructuring my role and had instead decided to accelerate the timeline for implementing his modernization plans throughout the firm. According to Jennifer, Marcus viewed the client departures as temporary disruptions that would resolve themselves once his new operational systems were fully implemented and clients experienced the benefits of automated portfolio management. His confidence in the superiority of his approach was apparently unshaken by the objective evidence that sophisticated clients strongly preferred personalized service over standardized efficiency. More troubling was Jennifer's report that Marcus had begun pressuring the firm's remaining senior advisors to accept similar restructuring of their roles and client relationships. The goal was to eliminate individual advisory relationships throughout Wellington Financial and replace them with team-based management structures that could be supervised more closely and standardized more easily. The strategy was clearly designed to prevent other advisors from following my example and departing with their client relationships intact. By forcing all advisors to work within standardized systems and protocols, Marcus hoped to make it impossible for individual professionals to maintain the kind of personal client relationships that could survive a transition to competitor firms. But Jennifer's analysis suggested that Marcus's strategy was likely to backfire by accelerating the departure of experienced advisors who valued their independence and client relationships more than job security at a firm that no longer supported relationship-based wealth management. The resulting brain drain would leave Wellington Financial with junior staff members who lacked the expertise necessary to serve sophisticated clients, regardless of what technological systems were available to support them. The conversation with Jennifer also revealed that my departure had created opportunities for advancement within Wellington Financial that were being filled by advisors who shared Marcus's vision for automated, standardized service delivery. Bradley Morrison had already been promoted to senior vice president and was being positioned as a model for the kind of advisor who would succeed under the firm's new operational approach. The promotion of someone with Bradley's limited experience and questionable competence to a senior leadership role was both symbolically and practically significant. It demonstrated Marcus's commitment to his efficiency-focused vision regardless of the impact on service quality, and it sent a clear message to other advisors about what characteristics were valued under his leadership. But the promotion also created additional risks for Wellington Financial's remaining clients, who would increasingly be served by advisors who lacked the experience and expertise necessary for sophisticated wealth management. The combination of standardized procedures and inexperienced staff was likely to result in poor investment decisions and inadequate financial planning that could have serious long-term consequences for client portfolios. As I prepared for what would be my final week at Wellington Financial Group, I reflected on how completely the firm's culture and priorities had changed since Marcus Wellington III assumed leadership. The institution that had once prided itself on personalized service and relationship-based wealth management was being transformed into something that resembled a technology company that happened to provide financial services. The transformation was both sad and unnecessary. Wellington Financial had been successful for decades, precisely because it offered something different from the automated, impersonal service that clients could receive from larger institutions. By abandoning that differentiation in favor of operational efficiency, Marcus was eliminating the competitive advantages that had made the firm valuable in the first place. But the change also represented an opportunity to demonstrate that relationship-based wealth management could thrive independently of institutional support. Our new advisory firm would serve as proof that sophisticated clients would reward superior service with their loyalty and their assets, even if that meant working with a smaller, more specialized organization rather than a large, established institution. The final preparations for our firm's launch were proceeding smoothly, with regulatory approvals on track and client transition procedures nearly complete. Within 1 week, I would begin the next phase of my career with the support of clients who had chosen expertise and personalization over operational efficiency and cost minimization. Marcus Wellington III had made the biggest mistake of his privileged life when he decided that my 19 years of experience and $1.2 billion in client relationships were less valuable than the marginal cost savings his termination would provide. He was about to learn that in the wealth management industry, client loyalty was more powerful than corporate strategy, and relationship-based service was more valuable than technological innovation. The real test would begin when our new firm opened its doors and demonstrated whether the principles that had guided my career could succeed in direct competition with the automated, efficiency-focused approach that was becoming increasingly common throughout the financial services industry. But given the overwhelming support I had received from clients who controlled over $1 billion in assets, I was confident that the outcome would validate everything I had learned about wealth management during my 19 years at Wellington Financial Group. The morning of my final day at Wellington Financial Group arrived with an urgency that had been building throughout the week. David Chen and I were scheduled to officially launch our independent advisory firm at noon, and by 10 o'clock, we had received confirmation that 38 of my former clients representing over $900 million in assets had completed their transfer paperwork. The exodus from Wellington Financial was nearly complete, leaving Marcus Wellington III to face the consequences of his catastrophic miscalculation. Jennifer Walsh called me at 9:15 with news that would have been shocking if I hadn't already witnessed Marcus's capacity for self-destruction firsthand. According to her, he had spent the previous evening in an emergency board meeting where he attempted to convince Wellington Financial's directors that the client departures were actually beneficial because they eliminated, quote, unprofitable relationships that required excessive servicing costs. His argument was that the firm would be more efficient and profitable serving a larger number of smaller accounts through automated systems rather than providing personalized service to ultra-high net worth clients. The board's response had been swift and decisive. By unanimous vote, they had removed Marcus Wellington III from his position as Chief Executive Officer and appointed Jennifer Walsh as interim CEO while they searched for permanent leadership. The directors had apparently concluded that Marcus's vision for Wellington Financial was fundamentally incompatible with the firm's core business model and client base. But the damage Marcus had inflicted during his brief tenure would take years to repair, if it could be repaired at all. Beyond the massive client defections, Wellington Financial had lost credibility within Seattle's wealth management community and faced potential regulatory scrutiny regarding the handling of client transitions. Several of the firm's most experienced advisors had already submitted resignation letters, unwilling to work for an organization that had demonstrated such poor judgment in its leadership decisions. Jennifer's call was both congratulatory and melancholy. She understood that my departure represented not just a personal career transition, but also the end of an era for Wellington Financial Group. The firm that Marcus Wellington II had built through decades of relationship-focused wealth management was being permanently diminished by his son's misguided attempts at modernization. At 11 o'clock, I walked out of the Meridian Tower for the final time as a Wellington Financial employee, carrying a single box containing personal items and client documents that would help ensure continuity of service at our new firm. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. After 19 years of building my career within an institutional framework, I was finally free to practice wealth management according to my own principles and standards. David Chen was waiting in the lobby of our new office building, a restored historic structure in downtown Seattle that perfectly embodied our firm's commitment to combining traditional service values with modern capabilities. The space we had selected was elegant but not ostentatious, professional but not intimidating, designed to make clients feel comfortable rather than impressed by displays of wealth. Our first official meeting as an independent advisory firm was scheduled for 1 o'clock with Elena Rodriguez, who had specifically requested to be among the first clients served under our new structure. Elena arrived precisely on time, carrying the same warm smile that had made our professional relationship evolve into genuine friendship over 7 years of working together. The conversation with Elena lasted nearly 2 hours and covered everything from her portfolio's current positioning to her long-term financial goals and estate planning considerations. But the most significant aspect of our meeting was Elena's expression of complete confidence in our decision to establish an independent firm. According to her, the personalized attention and expertise she valued most had never been dependent on Wellington Financial's institutional resources. They had always been the result of our personal relationship and my commitment to understanding her unique circumstances. Elena's assessment was confirmed throughout the afternoon, as client after client expressed similar sentiments about their decisions to follow me to our new firm. David Chen conducted his own transition meeting, during which he outlined his vision for how our family office structure could eventually expand to serve other ultra-high net worth families who valued relationship-based wealth management over institutional efficiency. By 5 o'clock, we had conducted 7 client meetings and received commitments for an additional $150 million in assets that would be transferred to our firm within the coming weeks. The total assets under management would exceed $1 billion, making us the largest independent advisory firm in the Pacific Northwest and demonstrating conclusively that sophisticated clients would reward superior service with their loyalty. The success of our launch was gratifying on multiple levels, but it was also validation of everything I had learned about wealth management during my 19 years at Wellington Financial Group. Clients chose to work with advisors they trusted rather than with institutions they recognized, and that trust had to be earned through consistent performance and genuine commitment to their financial success. At 6:30, my phone rang with a call that provided the perfect capstone to our successful launch. Marcus Wellington III was requesting an immediate meeting to discuss what he termed mutually beneficial arrangements that could address the, quote, unfortunate misunderstandings that had led to my departure from Wellington Financial. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, and his willingness to contact me directly rather than working through Jennifer Walsh suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. I agreed to meet with Marcus at 7 o'clock in the lobby of his downtown hotel, partly out of curiosity about what he might propose, and partly because I wanted to witness firsthand his acknowledgement of the disaster his leadership had created. The conversation would also provide an opportunity to ensure that any remaining client transfer issues were resolved without additional complications. Marcus arrived at our meeting looking haggard and defeated, his usual confidence replaced by the desperate energy of someone who had watched his inherited position crumble through his own poor judgment. He had apparently spent the day attempting to develop strategies for retaining Wellington Financial's remaining clients and preventing additional advisor departures, but his efforts had been hampered by the firm's damaged reputation and the board's loss of confidence in his leadership. His proposal was both predictable and pathetic. According to Marcus, Wellington Financial was prepared to offer me a partnership position with complete autonomy over my client relationships and investment strategies, along with equity ownership that would make me one of the firm's largest shareholders. The offer represented a complete reversal of everything he had said during my termination meeting just 1 week earlier. But Marcus's proposal also revealed his continued misunderstanding of why I had left Wellington Financial and why his modernization efforts had failed so catastrophically. He seemed to believe that my departure had been motivated by inadequate compensation or insufficient recognition, rather than fundamental disagreement with his vision for the firm's future direction. I explained to Marcus that his offer was irrelevant because the damage to Wellington Financial's culture and client relationships could not be repaired through individual accommodations or financial incentives. The firm's commitment to operational efficiency over service quality had created systemic problems that would persist regardless of what role I might be offered within the organization. More importantly, our independent advisory firm was already providing the kind of service and client relationships that I valued most, without the institutional constraints and competing priorities that had made working at Wellington Financial increasingly frustrating, even before Marcus assumed leadership. The freedom to practice wealth management according to my own standards was worth more than any partnership arrangement he could propose. Marcus's response to my rejection was a mixture of anger and disbelief, that perfectly captured his sense of entitlement and lack of understanding about the wealth management industry. According to him, I was making a serious mistake by choosing to work independently rather than accepting his generous offer to return to Wellington Financial under improved terms. His assumption that I should be grateful for the opportunity to work for him again, despite his having terminated my employment just 1 week earlier, demonstrated the same arrogance and poor judgment that had created the crisis he was now desperately trying to resolve. Marcus apparently believed that his family name and institutional position made him inherently more valuable than the expertise and client relationships that actually drove success in wealth management. The meeting ended with Marcus warning me that competing with Wellington Financial would be more difficult than I realized, and that my independent firm would struggle to provide the sophisticated services that institutional clients required. His threats were empty and his predictions were wrong, but they provided additional confirmation that he had learned nothing from the catastrophic failure of his leadership tenure. 3 months later, our independent advisory firm was managing over $1.4 billion in assets for 63 clients who had chosen relationship-based wealth management over institutional efficiency. Wellington Financial Group had been acquired by a larger investment bank at a substantial discount to its previous valuation, with Marcus Wellington III receiving a settlement that allowed him to pursue other opportunities outside the financial services industry. The acquisition marked the end of Wellington Financial as an independent firm and confirmed that Marcus's vision for automated, standardized wealth management had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The institutional buyers were primarily interested in the firm's technology infrastructure and regulatory licenses, rather than its client relationships or advisory expertise. Jennifer Walsh had accepted a senior position with our firm, bringing her operational expertise and institutional knowledge to support our continued growth and expansion. Her decision to join us represented another vote of confidence from someone who understood both the challenges facing traditional wealth management firms and the opportunities available to organizations that prioritized service quality over operational efficiency. The success of our independent firm had also attracted attention from other experienced advisors who were frustrated with the corporate constraints and conflicting priorities they faced at larger institutions. We had grown from a 2-person partnership to a team of 12 professionals who shared our commitment to relationship-based wealth management and personalized client service. Most importantly, our clients had achieved investment returns that consistently exceeded market benchmarks, while receiving the kind of personalized attention and strategic guidance that had become increasingly rare in the wealth management industry. The combination of superior performance and exceptional service had generated referrals that allowed us to expand our client base while maintaining the high standards that had made our firm successful. Looking back on the events that had transformed my career and vindicated my approach to wealth management, I realized that Marcus Wellington III had actually done me an enormous favor by forcing me to leave Wellington Financial Group. His misguided attempt to eliminate my position had created the catalyst necessary for establishing something better and more aligned with my professional values. The 19 years I had spent building my expertise and client relationships at Wellington Financial had prepared me perfectly for the independence and responsibility that came with operating my own advisory firm. The trust and loyalty I had earned from clients who controlled over $1 billion in assets had proven more valuable than any institutional affiliation or corporate security. Marcus Wellington III had learned too late that in the wealth management industry, relationships were more important than operational efficiency, expertise was more valuable than cost reduction, and client loyalty was more powerful than corporate strategy. His attempt to modernize his father's firm through automation and standardization had destroyed everything that had made Wellington Financial successful in the first place. The final irony was that Marcus had achieved the opposite of everything he had intended when he decided to terminate my employment. Instead of reducing costs and improving efficiency, his decisions had resulted in massive client defections and damaged the firm's reputation beyond repair. Instead of modernizing Wellington Financial for future success, he had made it so vulnerable that it became an acquisition target for larger competitors. Our independent advisory firm had become everything that Wellington Financial Group could have been if Marcus had chosen to build on his father's legacy, rather than destroying it through misguided attempts at corporate transformation. We had proven that relationship-based wealth management could thrive in direct competition with institutional efficiency, and that sophisticated clients would reward superior service with their trust and their assets. The lesson was clear for anyone in the financial services industry who was willing to learn from Marcus Wellington III's catastrophic mistakes. In wealth management, as in most professional service industries, success came from understanding and serving clients, rather than from optimizing internal operations and reducing costs. The firms that forgot that fundamental principle would inevitably face the same fate that had befallen Wellington Financial Group. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.